Hello, good afternoon. All right, so we are covering the first subject before test 3. And thank you for the messages asking me for the study guides. Um, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to your test 2 curve. I'm going to add at least 5 points, 5 more to your curve for having failed to give you a study guide. So I want to apologize for that. And then if you'll notice, I put study guide for test 3 up. When you look at the bottom where it says to go to quizzes and take, when to go to quizzes and take test 3, I have the study guide as a file attached under it. Okay, so please, as soon as you can, print that out. Keep that in mind when we go over material, as it obviously tells you, informs you as to what you'll be tested on. All right. Thank you so much, as always, for your patience in this class. As I'm down to the wire and I must do much grading, I'm going to probably pull some all-nighters, and that's on me for allowing other responsibilities and so forth to get in my way there. Keep in mind also that I'm changing every semester, virtually, at least to a small degree, every single assignment that you guys are doing. I'm trying to add to them, improve them, etc. So I promise you I've been busy, but it's no excuse. And I thank you for messaging me as I'm trying to catch up on those and just hanging in there with me. All right, especially with the pace. So also, I want to let you know that for Wednesday, I plan to give you an announcement, and I apologize for those of you for whom this doesn't work well with your working schedule, etc. But for Wednesday, I'm going to push it up to 3 o'clock. Okay, I hope that you'll be okay with that, and the same number of people could hopefully make it. If I could get a little personal for a moment, I have a nephew who is playing for the United States B team in the Gold Cup. As if you've been following it, he scored a goal against Trinidad and Tobago, or no, I'm sorry, St. Kitts and Nevis. No, Trinidad and Tobago. And he was in the shootout against Canada, and he thankfully made his shot. They won, and they're playing Panama, and the winner of that game plays the winner of Jamaica and Mexico for the Gold Cup. And so at any rate, I'm just really excited about that, having a nephew in it. And he's 19 years old, so hopefully just going to get better. And the unspoken assumption on the team is that it's a tryout to try to become a sub for the first team, the players of which are playing overseas in Europe at higher caliber ball. He plays in the MLS. He plays for the San Jose Earthquakes. So at any rate, their game is at 4:30, and they're playing in San Diego, and I don't want to miss it. It could be a once in a lifetime thing for my family and I. So I want to push up this time, and this should be the last time. Thank you, Sarah. I want to push up the time from 3 to 4. If you could please indulge me that, I would greatly appreciate it. All right. So today we're going to get into the Jacksonian time period. No, that's a great question. He's never made it up to that par. It seems like every tournament that they play in, they either go with their A team or their B team. And when they go with their A team, the only exceptions who are not playing in Europe are a couple goalies and a couple fullbacks playing on defense. Everyone else at every other position is playing in a higher Premier League, like Christian Pulisic in England, the Bundesliga in Germany, etc. He is, so I don't think he's even met Pulisic, but what he's hoping for is, so far he's standing out fairly well. He's a winger. He's a left winger. I'm hoping that our hope is that he can become Christian Pulisic's backup. because you play 11 and they get to keep 23 on the roster. And so that's what we're hoping for. And he has, he has good competition at the left wing with other young players. There's a Paredes kid who played with him on the under-20 team that's really good. Zendejas is good. And then the older established guys like Jordan Morris for the Seattle Sounders. But yes, sir, that is true. If the writers are correct, the Inter Miami will come to San Jose Earthquakes in 2014, and Cade will get to play against Messi. Thankfully, not on defense, and have to, because Messi would make a fool of him, I'm sure. But yeah, they both, Messi's a midfielder, number 10 in the center, and Cade is a left winger up front. But we're so excited. And so, yeah, if any of you, as soon as they begin selling non-season tickets, they're selling season tickets now. But if you wanted tickets for that game, just keep yourself updated whenever the Earthquakes put it out. And I'm sure that game is going to sell out very quickly. That would be something else, though, to see that. So at any rate, I'm going to go ahead and share the page. All right. And we'll get right into it, if that's okay. All right. So in this one, right, first of all, I kind of succumbed to tradition and calling it the Jacksonian time period. Remember, that's great man history. That's implying that to understand the time period and the direction in which it went, you have to understand the leaders in great positions of power. And in a lot of ways that type of historiography is obsolete. Now we like history from below. We like structural history with like things that don't have names and faces and are much larger than any individual or group of individuals. And but yet for some reason we haven't changed defining this time period as the quote Jacksonian time period, because Andrew Jackson was so integral to all of this. All right. So what happens in the late 1820s and throughout the 1830s is a lot of us still take a lot of stock into the writings of one single man who only traveled to about 5 states throughout the U.S., was not here that long in time, but wrote a classic. And his name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he wrote Democracy in America. All right. So some of it is, I would say about half of it are observations of Americans as a French tourist, if you will. And then half of it are his, extrapolations about what he thinks about such observations. All right. But to him, right, he says that there had, from the time of the War for Independence to this time, Americans had apparently undergone a great cultural revolution, if you will. And it's really simple. And that is that this culture was dead bent on praising and accommodating the common white man, the common white male citizen. All right. It became in vogue, according to him and other primary sources, if you wanted to run for office, to try your best to identify with the common, poor, ambitious white man. So this ran right up the alley for people like Andrew Jackson. He had come from Scots-Irish descent. His father died in a logging accident while his mother was pregnant with him. His mother and brother died in the War for Independence. He was orphaned by the time he was 14 years old. He kind of ascended through a lot of, well, to be honest, reading his biographies, a lot of it was attaching himself to the right people in the Nashville area. He apprenticed himself to a lawyer. He apprenticed himself before that to a group of land surveyors. And so he tries these avenues as means to make a name for himself, become, powerful, popular, and wealthy. Okay. And then he also becomes a slave-owning cash crop farmer, and a lot of the typical avenues of that time period toward the American dream. But in North Carolina, when his parents and that generation was coming in during the War for Independence from Europe, the Scots-Irish were seen to be as the scum of the earth. And also they had a reputation that preceded them for being libertarian, uber libertarian, to the point of being defiant of all authority. And so North Carolina issued an edict by the legislator and said, we don't want you, keep moving on through. And Daniel Boone became kind of their spokesman. He, quote, discovered the Cumberland Gap through the Appalachian Mountains, and a lot of them moved into present day Kentucky and Tennessee. So they were seen, just a generation behind as being kind of scummy. They did not occupy offices virtually in any of the assemblies, either colonial or post-independence. A lot of them, it took a generation for them to really kind of make it up into what you might consider white collar employment. But this was their day. And so they wanted people, they called them log cabin campaigns, where you tried to outdo the other guy, saying that you were born in a log cabin, you fought grizzly bears, the whole idea of the self-made man, right? That you know what it's like to live in poverty, to live in hardship, and to endure and surmount those obstacles. And so, like Hofstadter says, offices began falling into his lap like ripe fruit from a tree. And he began ascending in political office after he had become a judge, after he had been a lawyer. And remember, not until about the turn of the 20th century, not until about like in the 1890s, do you have the bar exam for lawyers. So that was the informal way by which you would do it. It's just apprentice yourself to a lawyer and have so many hours working with and for and under him. So at any rate, at this time, right, he really sold it. Not only his background, not only even his temperament. He was known to have that frontier temperament. He had been involved in multiple duels, pistol duels, one of which left a bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. He had been known for many fistfights, etc. And so that leads to another part of this, right? Is that when he and others began to be elected into office, there already were some democratizing trends in the political system that we're going to get into shortly, that were enabling them to come to power, okay? And when they did, they tried to ingratiate their voters, right? And to win their votes for re-election. And so the problem is, and Alexa de Tocqueville wrote about this, he was not always praising Americans in observing them and how, quote, democratic they were in their culture and their institutions, etc. But he contends, right, that there was an ugly side to all this. And I would call that populism, right? With populism, to me, is you oftentimes, you're not afraid to appeal to the lowest common denominators of your voters. So if they are xenophobic towards certain ethnic groups, you don't try to correct it, you run with it. You capitalize on it for your own gain as a political leader, as an elected leader. If they have a bent against, and by the way, all these are the case, if they had a case against urban bourgeois leaders, those who have been rich for multiple generations from the northeastern cities, especially creditors or bankers, there was a large distrust of them as leeches and parasites, etc. There also was a lot of low esteem toward the intelligentsia. There was an expression that was often used, and that was putting on airs, acting as if you're superior to others, when of course they're telling you in reality that you're not. So those who went to Ivy League schools and lived more of a kind of a cosmopolitan lifestyle, they were somewhat ostracized at this time. This was the common man's time, right? And so you have that component as well. So with populism, you're going to see an element to which the politicians are going to ingratiate people with the base parts of their personalities, of their desires, of their hatred, of their envy, etc. And then, of course, people, critics of democracy, going back to the Greeks at least, have always said that watch out in a democratic government for people constantly envying the wealth of the rich and go into even drastic measures to try to either take from them or to join their class. All right. So all this comes into it. So like I said, be careful what you ask for. This was a mixed bag. So on the good side, right, by today's Whig standards, WHIG, like the Whig Liberal Party coming from English political tradition, we like the idea of more popular participation in government. And that did happen. Mind you, Jackson didn't make this happen. He was simply a beneficiary of it who ran with it and, of course, supported it. Because, of course, as Hofstadter says, why wouldn't he? He was popular. The people loved him. So at any rate, you have, for instance, the nomination process, okay, for candidates. At this different upper branches, you have it in the upper house and the state legislators, and you had it in the Senate, in Congress. The upper house would try to get together and conspire and decide who was going to run for office. All right. And so that was a very aristocratic, manner by which offices were candidates were nominated. Then, of course, the common citizens could vote, but they didn't get a choice as far as the choices that they had to choose from, right? Well, that changes here. And the Democratic Party, they dropped Democratic Republicans as their title from Jefferson's day to just be simply known as Democrats. And by this time, and they start establishing the party convention system. And with this one, they would publicize in the newspapers a local assembly or convention. And all you had to do was be a citizen, and you had to sign up as a member of their party. And then when you went into this convention, you could nominate yourself. You could nominate anybody you like, as long as he was a citizen, for office, for any office. And then the winners at the regionals would go to the state level, the state would go to the national level, etc. So theoretically now, Joe Bob from Kentucky can run for a high federal office. He could be nominated at the grassroots level and theoretically be elected into office. So that process was democratized. Then also citizenship. Remember, the founding fathers did not have the stomach for universal citizenship. And so it was up to each state. Well, over 2/3 of the states dropped all property requirements for citizenship. So now the poor white males who are renters, who are sharecroppers, and just rent their property and don't own enough property in the past under English political tradition to be considered homesteaders, they're allowed to, they're enfranchised as citizens. So now that greatly increases the franchise of those who are citizens. And then also the manner by which people ran for office and in which they publicized all their rallies. They had rallies, parades, they gave speeches, they had press conferences when they addressed questions from citizens. And in this, right, supposedly there was great evidence of public participation. So there were a lot of people at the rallies, a lot of people in the parades, a lot of people voted on election day. Like, if you don't mind, look at this. For example, the percentage of eligible voters who voted for a presidential candidate rose from 26.9% in 1824 to over 80% in the presidential election of 1840. That is an incredible increase. So now there's more of a sense of accountability, right, to your voters, because they're likely going to go out to the polls and vote. All right. But mind you, when you went to vote, the Democrats had a poll in that oftentimes a booth, and the Whigs, because the Federalists kind of died at the end of the War of 1812. And so an oppositional party to Andrew Jackson, who they called or King Andrew, because they said he was a tyrant, called themselves the Whigs, like the Whigs of England, against the power of the English king. So the Whigs developed their own booths, and you came and you gave a verbal vote at the poll. So people booed you or they cheered you, etc. There was no private, booth to follow your own conscience. So of course there was a lot of peer pressure involved on voting days. So at any rate, you have those changes. Also, they semi-democratized the electoral system. With the electoral system originally, those electoral points were actual electors. They were actual men, right? And so what is it, like the number of congressmen that you have, right? You get one House rep for every 30,000 and 2 senators, no matter what. They combine that up to give you the number of electors that you have. So the bigger the population, the more electors that you get. Well, when you voted for a party's elector, and then that elector went to the state capitol in your state and made the vote for the person of your political party. But by the way, which is so strange to me, is they did not have to. There was nothing in law that stated they had to vote the way of their political party and the way their constituents had voted to put them as that particular elector in this position to vote. Sometimes they changed their mind and went with someone else. I kid you not. But at any rate, that was the case. Now, under the Jacksonian time period, they wanted just a direct popular vote, and whoever won, whatever party candidate won the majority, 50% plus 1 of the votes, those electoral points, as we do it today, were counted as such as automatic points for that candidate and that candidate's party. So they democratized it that way. Some, even Andrew Jackson himself, contended that they should end the electoral system and have a direct popular vote of the president. But of course, that didn't happen, as you know, because we still don't have that. We still have the electoral system today. So, and by the way, I read Edward Pesson's book on the time period here, because, for instance, going back to Alexis de Tocqueville, he said, Americans are just a sight to see, he said. He said, they will not finish the roof of their cabin, and they will decide rashly to sell that property and cabin and go for something bigger and better a little further west. He said Americans were never content. They were always expecting to and hoping to strike it rich. And note, there were 2 main avenues that Americans of their generation were looking to traverse on their way to the American dream. And those 2 broad categories you could easily guess. One was becoming a cash crop farmer, right? You get a decent amount of land and you decide upon a crop and you sell it. You sell the surplus of that crop for profit, okay? And the second one was any kind of broader entrepreneurial, just anything, starting a business of any sort, right? And as they say often, it takes money to make money. A lot of the poor common citizens, they wanted easy access to credit. Okay, they wanted land and they wanted easy access to credit to get business loans. Okay, to get going in their quest for the American dream. So at any rate, you have those types of democratic changes that were going on culturally, and then we also mentioned politically or institutionally. And when I use the term institutionally on a broader form, de Tocqueville said that even families that particularly sons were moving out sooner. They were marrying against the wishes of their parents. That old forms of English deference, right? Like knowing your place and being obedient to your superiors. that type of old English deference to your parents was quickly eroding before his eyes. And by the way, de Tocqueville came here to study our prison system, and instead became enamored with all this larger panoramic view of what he saw as that contemporary America. So you have that going on. All right. So then the ugly side. Well, one of them here is that Andrew Jackson, I'll go with the less severe first, is the bank war, right? There was a guy named Charles Biddle who was running the Bank of America, America's national bank, Hamilton's pet, if you will, right? A lot of the business loans, remember we go back to the early Republic assignment, a lot of the loans that were out, a lot of the subsidizing of businesses, right? A lot of the reception of people's investments and their bond purchases, a lot of it involved wealthy urban guys from the Northeast. Okay. So in the uneducated masses' eyes, not knowing the complexity of everything, or really probably thinking about Hamilton's rationale for all of this and trying to become an industrialized, self-sufficient economic giant as a republic. Instead, right, they claimed that this was a plutocracy, that it was a rule by the rich in the pockets of the government and the rich together at the expense of everybody else. So when it came time for the bank to be rechartered, right, Andrew Jackson refused to sign, and he let the charter die out. But what about, the funds that were coming in and out, et cetera, right? What he did is he tried to decentralize all that into state banks, state and regional banks, and they became known derisively by his enemies as wildcat banks. And because I think of like the 2008 bubble, they began lending recklessly, right? People, there wasn't a strict criterion for your, like as had been under England, a strict criterion for your ability to pay back those loans, right? Your collateral. So a lot of people defaulted on their loans throughout the country, and it helped create what they call a panic, an economic panic by 1837. And so, but to him, right, he said that he had been given a mandate from the people. And I think of like the Spanish word mandato, right? A command, that he had been given a command from his voters. This is what they wanted, and therefore this is what he was going to give them. So notice, right, the word for the day was democracy. The word for the day is what the masses of civilians wanted, of citizens, what they wanted. And as you recall, remember the founding fathers, they're very delicate over this and contending that, no, we want a mixed government. We want a republic, right? We don't want all offices democratically elected for good reason, they said, in the spirit of Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws book and the Enlightenment about checks and balances and so forth. Because remember, John Adams had warned for quite some time that the majority could become just as tyrannical over the numerical minority as any other faction or individual could become. Okay, so everything with Andrew Jackson is about the people have spoken. This is what the people want, and therefore, how could he dare question, the rightness of his cause? So the more severe case that becomes famous are the Trails of Tears, right? A big irony that you find here with the Trails of Tears is if you look up Eshota, Echota, that was the Republic of the Cherokee, okay? And find just to the extent to which they were assimilating to Anglo-American institutions, practices, values, etc. I think you would agree with me that they did quite such. So for instance, they detribalized the land and allotted it in private plots. So individual land ownership, like good capitalists, right? A lot of them made their money off of being cash crop farmers, some of whom, by the way, even bought slaves and used slave labor. Some of these Cherokee and other land grandees who were doing well for themselves. They brought in a couple different denominations. It was mainly the Methodists, and I can't remember the other denomination. It was mainly the Methodists. They would bring these missionaries in and establish schools for their kids. And then you had that guy Sequoyah, who phonetically used the English alphabet to write out the Cherokee language. And so a lot of the kids were bilingual at these schools. A lot of them did assimilate and become Christian. And their artisan class of skilled workers were second to none as well. And a lot of the chiefs sent their sons to Ivy League schools, etc., to receive a collegiate education in the Anglo-American way or tradition. All right. But despite that, there still was so much anti-Native American sentiment. Remember that you had the bad memory from the Creek down in that area, because they chose to be red sticks, painting red ochre on their tomahawks and guns and siding with the British against us. So of course we vindictively took Creek lands from them for choosing the wrong side at the end of the War of 1812. Then you had the Seminole Wars. We had two of them that dragged down into Georgia and Florida, etc. And so you had those factors that kept anti-Native American sentiment alive. And then also you have what a lot of historians, feel safe to infer is just downright envy of their lands. All right. So at this time, the state of Georgia, the state of North Carolina, I think one or two others, issued eminent domain laws to the native tribes inside their territories. All right. And so remember, eminent domain is supposed to be today, like for a hospital, a freeway, public elementary school, etc., right? Whereby you are forced to sell your private land at market value back to the government, as the government will better use it for the general welfare rather than for your private good. Well, what do you know? No sooner do they begin to try to heavy-handedly force the native tribes into selling their lands with eminent domain back to the states. They're already fomenting within propaganda, etc., the plans of selling acreage to their citizens. So they're basically buying votes doing this, right? That's what the racist, poor, white, ambitious, common citizens that voted for them wanted, was that native land. And so at any rate, the Native Americans, you have to remember that in the Constitution, as well as in 1823, I believe it was, in the McIntosh case, the government made it clear that Native American tribes are semi-sovereign nations within the nation, that they're not beholden to state laws, and that they are the ward, W-A-R-D, of the federal government. And of course, when you look at historically, when any demographic has been labeled as ward of the state, a lot of abuse has happened from that. So an example of wards of the state were orphan kids, right, who had no parents, and they were put under the direct tutelage, the direct care of the government. And so that's the dependent status they were given, were the wards of the state. So at any rate, they take it to court. They try the humanitarianism of the justices, of the judges, to no avail. So they get a new lawyer and they try again under a guy named William Wirt, W-I-R-T. Well, he was more shrewd about it. He said, I'm not going to try to appeal to their humanitarianism. I'm going to appeal to the chief justices, their old federalist political tendencies. Having a federal system, which remember is supposed to be a balance between a unitary government when the central government controls everything everywhere, and a confederacy where the states are virtually sovereign and autonomous on their own. The federal part is in the middle, right? Where the central government has certain powers over the states and regional levels, and the states get to share concurrently some powers with the federal government, and the states are reserved certain powers alone that the federal government is not to touch. And so with that federal narrative, he says, so let's get this straight. So in the Treaty of New Eshota, the federal government granted this land to the Cherokee, right? But the mere state of Georgia says no, and they have and issues an eminent domain law that abrogates or does away with that federal treaty. They said, well, look out in the future. You're giving states the power to override federal treaties. And that tactic worked. The Supreme Court justices sided with the Cherokee and the Worcester case, and they decided that a federal treaty always prevails over a state law, and therefore, on behalf of the Treaty of New Eshota, the Cherokee can stay, and the state cannot coerce them to sell their property. Well, in comes Andrew Jackson, and he just overtly defies the Supreme Court's decision and says, again, he's had a mandate from the people. He clearly has been given a command from what the majority of citizens want, and they want the Native Americans to sell that land. He says, secondly, the Native Americans, he goes the paternalistic route, right? The condescendingly paternalistic route. He says the Native Americans are unassimilable, that even though they're trying to, they will never be able to fully integrate with white Anglo-America. And he says, insofar as that they cannot integrate, he said, conflict is inevitable. As long as they stay separate, and he said they always will, conflict will inevitably arise. And he says, because of numbers and technology alone, the Anglo-Americans are going to win, and they're going to eventually wipe out the Native American people. So he says, as they are the ward of the state, he is going to remove them for their own protection to a safe territory, right, across the Mississippi, into present-day Oklahoma and Arkansas, put as Indian territory. So his men go there, and there were like 19, there were several Trails of Tears. But the one that was famous, right, you had like 1 in 6, like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 Native Americans die either en route or once they got shortly after arriving to the military forts in Arkansas and Oklahoma. The big ones were Forts Gibson and Fort Smith there in Oklahoma and Arkansas. So at any rate, the natives had to sell their stuff. They got upon these wagons. They went at a terrible time of the year where they had to go through the worst part of the winter. And supposedly the women noticed the warriors standing up, looking at the land they were leaving, and they had tears streaking their faces. And they said, look at this, even the warriors are crying. And it became known as the Trail of Tears. And so the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and a few other tribes were forcefully sent from the Carolinas and Georgia to Oklahoma and Arkansas into, quote, Indian territory. And it's so sad because the leader of the Cherokee sent his son to Connecticut to go to college. and the son fell in love with an Anglo-American young girl who had a politically powerful dad, and he supposedly went through great inner turmoil in signing this. And as you see later on in your 17B class, in the quote Indian Wars after the Civil War in the far West, there seemed to be kind of a dichotomy that not always, but oftentimes went by age. A lot of the younger warriors wanted to stay and fight and refused to be removed, and a lot of the elder statesmen literally, acted like they were too old, they were too tired, they were very defeatist, and said, you know what, this is unfair, but this is our best chance for survival. It's just being separated from a hostile environment. And so at any rate, that young man, how did I put his picture in here? Can't believe I'm forgetting his name at this moment, but no, I don't have his picture there. But at any rate, that young man scarcely made it back after signing the treaty to Oklahoma, and his own warriors violently murdered him as like the traitor who touched the white man's pen, the paleface's pen, because oftentimes the Native Americans were not literate, especially in the English language. So they would have a scribe with a quill pen. They would try their best to anglicize their name, and they would write out their name as a signature, and they would ask the native leader to literally put his finger on the top of the pen as he was writing it. And so to some of the tribes, right, it became, especially from this point on, it became like tantamount to treason to your own people to touch the paleface's pen. But it happens, sadly. And so they were removed, and there were thousands who died. And so I say here at the end, right, as has been explained by critics, sometimes democracy is like two wolves and one lamb voting on what's for dinner. All right. So anybody have any questions? Right. So moving on to number 2, all right, is women. What I give here, okay, is I thought I'd be a little different. In most the books that I've read on women's rights in the 19th century, in the 1800s, a lot of it is great woman history. They simply say, okay, here, this woman opened up this door. This woman challenged that. This woman attained that. I don't mean to take anything away from that, but I just thought I'd go a little bit broader, different route. So mine on number 2 is structural history. Remember, where you make the assumption beforehand that it's not any person or even group of people who really are, foundationally responsible for a big change, but it's larger forces that are bigger than any person that help bring about such change. So what are those larger forces? Okay. What I put here is one is westward migration. All right. So the westward migration movement. And everything I've read on this topic, it was bittersweet. It was losing multiple battles to win a war. And that is a lot of the cases of women gaining rights in the court of law stemmed from injustices that they faced amidst the westward movement. So for one was abandonment. A lot of men during the gold rush and these time periods, 1843 was a big year and getting a lot of people across the overland trail, the Oregon Trail. From then on, you had, the tens, oftentimes at least tens of thousands come every year just across the Oregon Trail alone. And so they're going there, right? And a lot of them decided to, for various reasons, they struck it rich, and that changed them. They were dejected and didn't want to come home feeling like losers, just the opposite. Some just wanted a chance to renew their own identity. A lot of people changed their names, etc., and just literally tried to start over in the West. So for multiple reasons, a lot of men never returned to their families, to their wives and children. So in the eastern states, a lot of the women began suing for divorce, because under English common law, right, it was it had to be a pretty severe case, pretty anomalous, out of the ordinary, for a woman to be able to take the initiative with divorce. So now they began doing so in considerable numbers. And of course, they used the old separate spheres cultural paradigm to make their argument. Under the separate spheres cultural paradigm, men are inherently tough, strong, logical, capable, but they're also corrupt. And so they belong in the public sphere, because you can't corrupt something that's already corrupted, and they have the means to endure in politics, at the workplace, etc., etc. Women are delicate, are virtuous, are emotional, etc. So they ought to keep that virtue tied up into the private sphere of the home, and imbue that virtue onto their children. Okay. And so the women started complaining in the courts, saying the men are supposed to be the man of the house. They're supposed to be the breadwinner. They're supposed to protect us and care for us and feed us. And they've abandoned us. So judges throughout the East began giving women right to sue for divorce, to gain custody of the children, and also to retain their private property. Because remember, under the English laws of coverture, no matter what a wealthy dad gave to his daughter, that was handed over to her husband the moment they got married under English common law. So this is the beginning of challenging that, so that women could retain their own property as well. All right, and wages. And then in the West, it was about their right to wages that they won in court. A lot of these women remained married, and the income of the husband was not sufficient, and they needed to work. And so they fought in several cases for the right for remuneration, right? The right to be compensated for their labor. A lot of them began inns, right? Like hotels in the West. And so they were, for the first time, were established the right to get business charters and bring in their own income and keep their own income, etc., without having to be single, right? And give that over to their husbands. And then you had cases of domestic abuse. And so in cases in California, especially during the gold rush, and women gained the right to separate from their husbands, gain their own property, their own job, etc., from abusive husbands. So the West, right, a lot of it stemmed, ironically, from victimization, but women during that movement were gaining some rights. All right. Then the other one was the first industrial revolution. That's the next structural component that I mentioned. Is in this first industrial revolution, a lot of the owners of the mills, Samuel Slater and these guys that are beginning steam-powered engines, right, facilitating different like loom machines to make clothing. Textiles was the first major industry. And so they began, putting multiple workers under one roof. Well, for various reasons, and of course, the obvious one is that they wanted to use the most easily exploitable demographic that they could. And believe it or not, there was already this early, there was a kickback against child labor. And so the next best thing were young, unmarried adolescent women, because the idea is they were either still, as unmarried, still under the protection of the breadwinning father, or some of them had become married and they were under the breadwinning protection of their husband. So hence, it was assumed culturally that they didn't need to receive subsistence wages. They didn't need to receive enough in wages to live off of, right? Because what they were earning was considered to be supplemental, like the cherry on top to whatever the males in their family were doing to provide for them. So they began, however, they wanted to keep them for long periods of time, and so they put them in dormitories. So they got to have these bunk beds in these dormitories and work long hours with one another, and that kind of was eye-opening to a lot of young women. They could articulate and share and hear from other young women what they were going through, what one another was going through, and they found out similarities and common grievances, etc. And it didn't take too long that particularly the Lowell textile girls that became kind of famous because there was such advertisement and showing how well this new industrial system was working. They began to unionize and go on strikes, etc. And so I say that this is another step. This first industrial revolution is the beginnings of breaking up the nuclear family, and particularly the husband or the father's patriarchal hold over that family unit, as the kids now begin to go to school or go to work in factories, etc. It's the beginning of them, losing some of that patriarchal grip over them. So it broadened their horizons. It gave them some independent income. Of course, it was not subsistence. It was not enough to live off of in and of itself. But it was kind of a beginning. I'm making the argument here. All right. And then the third one that I contend is involvement in the antebellum reform movements. And to me, this one's huge. The more I read about these. Okay, what we're going to get to soon is in the 3 decades before the Civil War, and bellum is Latin for war, ante before. So the antebellum era is basically the 1830s through 1850s, before the big war, the Civil War of 1861. So during this antebellum period, you're going to see in a subsequent assignment that a plethora of reform movements arose. And we'll get into later why we think that was, okay? But for now, just note that it happened. And so you had movements for cleaning up crime and vice in the cities, as the cities were blowing up in numbers. You had protest against alcoholism, known as the temperance movement. And one of the numerically largest organizations in the antebellum period was the Women's Christian Temperance Movement against alcoholism. All right. You also had the abolitionist movement, the opposition to slavery. You had a movement against child labor. You had a movement against the injustices found in the prison systems. You had a movement for public education in all the states, public schools, and the list goes on and on. All right. Within a lot of these protest movements, okay, women began to actually speak in public to crowds that were mixed, men and women. And I know it's funny, but that was seen as taboo. And this was kind of a glass ceiling that was broken, is you have women now speaking before a multitude of people. They also went door to door and gathered signatures for certain protests. They would go on marches and parades. They would go to state legislators and attend the meetings, and then when the proper time arose, speak to the elected legislator. Right? So what are they doing here? Is, for one, they're kind of getting a dress rehearsal for their own feminist movement that would come later. They're learning the political tools that they're going to use subsequently for themselves, because sadly, they fight for all these other demographics and they have to basically fight for themselves, sadly, after fighting for these other groups first, right? But note, because a lot of these movements had, in essence, a sense that those who were caring for these victims, right, whatever the cause was, that it was still in line with women's stereotypical nature. That of course it's the women who are going to fight for the poor slaves. Of course it's the women that are going to fight for the children that are working in the mines. They're the sentimental type. They're the, they're the emotionally led. They're the virtuous ones. And so the very things that they fought for, the very movements that they joined, society kind of begrudgingly allowed them to do such, because it didn't really, as an undergirding, it didn't really violate the old separate spheres paradigm. They were still looking like, quote, traditional women, being different from men, joining these types of causes. All right. And then two other movements that were involved in the antebellum period that women were heavily involved with is, one was the Second Great Awakening. It was a big evangelical Christian movement. And Alan Brinkley in his textbook said that women outnumbered men 2 out of 3 in this movement, of numbers of people being baptized and those going to places and preaching, etc. So women are getting involved in the patriarchal religion of Christianity with the Second Great Awakening. And then also the transcendentalists and their utopian communities. These, right, what some people would say, okay, is even if you lose the battle at that time period, sometimes there needs to be a little bit of shock treatment and let people kind of absorb it in time, and it'll pave the way for future advances. Okay, because when I say that, because the women involved in these two movements, they were vilified, unlike what I just explained prior, that they were kind of allowed through the back door into politics, because those were causes that were supposedly, amenable to what they thought women would care about. But these are different. The transcendentalist, they stated, right, that every human being, period, black, white, male, female, period, every human being ought to be able to be free and autonomous to transcend his or her material existence, right? They were kind of like beatniks over 100 years later in the 1950s. They said, what is your life? Just earning food to feed yourself, get that white picket fence, have your 2.5 kids, have your boring job, and just do that and just go on the merry-go-round until it's done? They said, no, there's more to life than that. Everyone ought to be free to, one, cultivate him or herself, to learn as much about as many things as possible, that to learn about Eastern religions, they were open to learn about philosophy, etc., and educate themselves, right? And not only to cultivate themselves, but also to find what their meaning in life is. And what your meaning in life is might be different from my meaning of life, because all the best we can do, said the transcendentalist, instead of looking to the Bible or something like that, definitively, they said, was through your own personal experiences. Everything's kind of trial and error. So they accepted everyone in these transcendentalist communities in Massachusetts and in the Northeast. Okay, and they even tried utopian communities. The most famous one was Oneida, like the Oneida tribe of the Iroquois people, Oneida. So at these utopian communities, they tried to put self-realization and happiness into a mathematically discernible equation. So they say, so many hours, you have to study and learn new things. So many hours, you need to engage in manual labor and exercise. So many hours, you need to have solitude and reflection. So many hours of the week, you need to engage in altruism, putting yourself aside and doing some good deed for the community around you and serving one another. So they turned it into like this formula to try to make people feel complete so that they transcend their mere material existence. And so, and some of them, right, they even broke up the idea of the monogamous marriage. And it literally was like free love amongst the men and women. So, like I said, this gained a lot of shock, it had a lot of shock value. And the women were not accepted into these by the rest of the population who participated in them. But nevertheless, the shock value may or may not have helped prepare them in the succeeding future generation to challenge the separate spheres paradigm that women are inherently virtuous but fragile and belong in the home and all that stuff. All right. So at any rate, those are the three structural forces that I'm claiming helped women began to, free themselves from their marginalization and oppression. All right. Any questions? All right. Can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel okay? You feel okay about these two? Thank you. All right. Thank you. All right, you guys. Appreciate that. So if you guys have no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go if that's okay. And remember, I'll put it in an announcement, but I plan to have the Wednesdays Zoom at 3:00, push to 3 instead of 4. And I apologize for those of you that makes life a little more difficult. All right. You guys take care, okay? Thank you. Thank you. You guys take care.